The sudden drop in temperature this week suddenly it seems to have heralded the start of autumn, and I don't know about you, and I expect that other women in the room will identify with this, but in my house, the start of autumn is first marked by a change of clothing, which is the coming out of the tights and scarves, and finally the official start of autumn is the first wearing of the boots. So Jesus' ministry in Mark's Gospel heralds a new season of the kingdom of God. Until now, Jesus has begun to talk about the idea of the kingdom. And he's been going about in Galilee, doing some healings and casting out demons. And he's gathered around him a group of 12 disciples who he has called to come and follow him. But now in his public ministry, he starts to talk in parables. So what is a parable? A parable is a story or a metaphor which Jesus uses. It has a single point. Not every aspect of the story necessarily has a meaning, but Jesus uses the parable to tell us something about the kingdom of God. And the parable of the sower, or as commentators more accurately call it, the parable of the four soils, is the first parable that Jesus tells in the Gospel of Mark. And Jesus uses it firstly to introduce the idea of using a parable to tell them something. But then he also uses this parable to tell us something about how the kingdom of God comes and how it grows in individuals and in a community. And he chooses a farming analogy to do this. I'm actually going to earth the analogy in some 21st century London garden ideas to maybe be slightly more up to date. And so the title of this talk is Boulders, Bindweed and Blackberries. Boulders, Bindweed and Blackberries. But make no mistake, this is a charming story with quite a serious message. And it's actually pivotal in the Gospel of Mark because it can be viewed as a kind of paradigm for understanding all the other people that Jesus is going to meet later in the Gospel. And I'll try and illustrate what I mean by that briefly as I go through. And the people that Jesus meets and the way they respond to him broadly fall into four categories. So the first category of people, I'm calling them the half-hearted. The seed falls along the path and the birds come and eat it up. These are the people who, as soon as they hear it, Satan comes and takes away the word that is sown in them. So imagine the scene. Jesus is by the shore of the lake and a huge crowd has gathered. So much so that he gets into a boat, which actually the disciples have prepared for him in advance. And he gets into the boat and pushes out to the shore. And he kind of uses it as a sort of pulpit to address the crowd. And I wonder how many people that day who were in the crowd actually became disciples of Jesus, or by this time, Jesus had a certain amount of notoriety in his ministry. Did they turn up just to see what was going on, to hear some interesting things, perhaps to witness a miracle, or maybe they wanted to be healed themselves? But I wonder how many of them actually decided to follow Jesus, or whether they actually went home and just simply forgot all about what they'd seen and heard. And the people in this category are the people who hear the word but never really get going with their faith. And perhaps you are someone that has flirted with the idea of becoming a Christian, or maybe you've been invited to church or some sort of meeting, or maybe when you were at college someone invited you to something, or you've flirted with the idea but never really taken it very seriously, and actually you're quite happy to remain in the crowd. But also in this group of people, there might be people who think that they're Christians by association, and this is a school of thought where You might say, well, I live in a Christian country and therefore I'm a Christian, or I was baptized as a baby and therefore I'm a Christian, or my parents run the Alpha course or something and therefore I'm a Christian. But whilst these things are good in themselves, they don't actually make you a Christian. And each of us needs to decide for ourselves to be a follower of Jesus. So the second category of people I'm calling the hard-hearted. In the parable, some of the seed falls on rocky places where there was not much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched and they withered because they had no roots. Jesus' explanation is that when trouble or persecution comes because of the word, they quickly, or in some translations immediately, fall away. This is the hardest category to understand what Jesus is actually saying, I think. Jesus is talking about character and the ability to persevere as a Christian. And I like the Message translation of this particular text. It says, these are people who receive the word with enthusiasm, but there's such shallow soil of character that when the emotions wear off or some difficulty arises, there's nothing to show for it. And actually this word fall away is a Greek word. Just forgive me one Greek word in this sermon, if you don't mind. Skandalozontai, it's a great word, which means to fall away, a stumbling block, cause offence, or fall into a trap. And I think in the modern vernacular, it might translate roughly as immediately fade away. In this country, we're very unlikely to experience mortal danger for being a Christian. But have you hit some difficulty in following Jesus? Have things not turned out in your life how you expected? Is God on mute and not answering your prayers somehow? Do you have trouble in your life in a wider sense? Has your job not worked out? Have you been passed over for promotion? Are you in danger of losing your house because of interest rates? Or is your business suffering in this climate at the moment? Or do you have a serious illness or diagnosis or bereavement that you're coping with? Has disappointment set in? And the problem with disappointment is that it can become like a boulder in your life. We can become very hard-hearted through adversity. And I also accept that sometimes in adversity, it can actually bring us closer to God. But as I was preparing this word disappointment came up. And have you noticed that in a rockery, that only small plants can grow in between the rocks, and they don't find their way down and make deep roots? Are you finding it hard to go on with God in an intimate way? Will you let God's Spirit into your life to break up the hard ground? The third category of people are the heavy-hearted. In this third category, the seed falls among thorns, which grow up and choke the plants so that they did not bear grain. This represents people who hear the word, but the worries of this life, the deceitfulness of wealth, and the desires for other things come in and choke the word. I have to say, in my life, I have most often identified with this category of people, I think. Life has so many distractions, doesn't it? And things that compete with following Jesus. How exactly is wealth deceitful? It is, after all, inanimate. But Jesus said that the love of money is the root of all evil. And when the love of wealth overtakes other things. We can become consumed by it. And the desire for other things, well, I know all about this. Those who know me will know that I like clothes. And I can become obsessed by scrolling all those marketing emails that come into your phone and all the offers that are on at the moment. And quite recently, I became completely obsessed with getting a certain type of jacket, and it probably consumed spare time for a couple of weeks trying to identify the exact jacket that I wanted, even to the point that I dragged him along the King's Road looking for one of these jackets at one Saturday when it was even a hot day and I didn't even need it. And you can become completely consumed by desires. Okay, that's a silly example, but we can become so distracted by just the desire for all kinds of things, and it might be different. It might be a house, it might be a certain sort of interior, it might be a car, it might be a certain job. And when it comes to worry, well, it seems that we always have something to worry about. We're always predisposed to worry, aren't we? And we resolve one thing and something else crops up immediately. I had a very busy summer this year and spent very little time in my garden. And one weekend towards the end of August, I looked at it and thought, it looks very overgrown and it's bugging me. So I spent quite a few hours that weekend out there and discovered there was a serious bindweed problem in one corner of the garden. And so I set about trying to disentangle the bindweed from the plants and trying to uproot it and to try to eradicate it. But it's actually very difficult to eradicate. And the thing about bindweed is that it actually does have a flower. It has a little white flower, which is quite a pretty flower. And so it's attractive in its way. But when I'd untangled the bindweed from a number of plants, there was one rose bush that had no leaves on it at all where the bindweed had been, and another plant that had been sort of suppressed by it. And so a bindweed can just completely overrun a life, or a garden, basically, if it's left too long without being tackled. And I think the point that Jesus was making here was that the worries of this life, deceitfulness of wealth, and desire for other things creep up on us gradually. And one day we can wake up and realize that we're in the grip of financial concerns or ambition, or the desire for a certain type of house has consumed us, or something like that. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 6, he says, "Do not worry about your life, what you will eat, what you will wear." He definitely said that to me. "Why do you worry about clothes? Seek first the kingdom of God, and all these things will be given to you as well. Do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself." In one of the most poignant anecdotes in the Gospels, later in Mark's Gospel, he will meet the rich young ruler. And Jesus looks at him and loves him and says, "Go sell everything you have and give to the poor, and come follow me." And notice that Jesus doesn't say this to everyone he meets who has got money. But for this man, status and money were everything to him. And he couldn't give it up. He couldn't get his head around walking away from what he had to follow Jesus. If our hands are full of possessions and our hearts and minds are full of worry and the desire for other things, they are not free to receive God's gifts to us. And we are in danger of living without God, actually. And Jesus will go on to say that generosity and not stinginess or hoarding is the way. So the final category of people the fourth H, we've had the half-hearted, the hard-hearted, and the heavy-hearted. So my fourth H is the whole-hearted. The seed falls on good soil, and it produces a crop. Some 30, some 60, some 100-fold. These are people who hear the word, accept it, and produce a crop. Notice that Jesus tells the parable to the crowd, but he gives the explanation in private later to his disciples. And the main theme in this parable, and actually really the central point of it, is listening. And in verse 3, he begins the parable by saying, listen, and ends it by saying, those who have ears to hear, let them hear. They may be ever seeing and not perceiving. And this is rather strange language. But I quite like the Message translation of verse 9, which says, are you listening? Really listening? And for Mark, the people who listen are on the inside, and the people who don't listen are on the outside. There are only two ways of responding to the kingdom of God. You either hear it and accept it, and you're on the inside, or you don't listen properly and you're on the outside because you haven't really sought to understand it and engage with Jesus. And the emphasis in the parable is entirely on how people respond to Jesus. And until now, there have been three types of listening that he's talked about. There's a sort of listening that is in one ear and out the other. In other words, it's not serious listening. There's a sort of listening that enjoys and even agrees with what it's heard, joyfully and enthusiastically. But it never really leads to anything because there's no real commitment. And the third type of listening is that it'll listen if there's nothing better to do, but lose interest when something more exciting or interesting comes along to steal their attention. This year was a bumper crop of blackberries. And I have to say I like blackberries and was very pleased that, in fact, they're still selling them in the shops, more than any other year that I've ever noticed there being blackberries in the shops. And 1 and 2 years ago, canes were planted, and apparently for blackberries, they have had the perfect combination of sunshine at the right times and rain at the right times, and that has gone to produce this amazing crop of blackberries this year. There is a way of listening which produces fruit. Hearing the word, accepting Jesus, and accepting Jesus means abiding with him. It means going on with him, feeding on him and his word, and receiving the water of his spirit, a bit like the blackberries, will produce fruit. And what is the sort of fruit that God is interested in? I think he's talking about fruit at an individual level, and he's talking about it at a community level. And at an individual level, Galatians 5:22 says that the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, and self-control. And so fruit will show up in your character at an individual level when the kingdom of God takes root in your life. But I believe that Jesus is also talking about community. And it's really hard to ignore the multiplication and the actual numbers that Jesus mentions in the text. And an ear of wheat would produce 7 grains. And so a harvest of 30, 60, or 100 would be beyond the wildest dreams of the farmer. That would be an absolutely amazing bumper crop. And so it's hard to ignore that what Jesus is talking about is a harvest of souls, actually. And I think that we shouldn't try and dodge that with some softer idea of what fruit is. And as if to exemplify this, in chapter 5, Jesus will meet Legion and cast out many demons. And it says that Legion goes back to his community and tells everyone what God has done for him, and all the people are amazed. So I ask you, which of the 4 categories do you identify with today? If it's any consolation, all disciples identify with all the categories at some point in their journey with God. Are you ready to follow Jesus, perhaps for the very first time? Have you stopped moving forward with God because things got too tough? Has disappointment set in, a bit like boulders in your life? Are you in the grip of ambition or money or worry or some other thing in the world around you that is distracting you and stealing your attention, a bit like bindweed? Or perhaps like the Blackberries, you're in a bumper fruitful season and actually long to be more fruitful for God. The good news is there is always a way back to God. And today is the start of a new season. How will you respond to Jesus today?